Today, Americans have access to more kinds of food than essentially any other group of people at any time down to the present. This modern cornucopia is the product of many forces, including, among others, rapid global trade. Underlying it all, however, is the sheer amount of plant products that can be found growing throughout the United States. At least since the days of European exploration and arguably before them, America has been a kind of blender for imported and modified plants. Old-timey staples such as wheat, oats, sugarcane, rice, and when considering animals, hogs, horses, and cattle, were all foreign species imported by Europeans. And the varieties of these products found in markets today, as well as those of native species like corn or maize, are typically far different from those raised a century or two ago. For instance, almost all corn grown today in the United States for commercial purposes is some kind of yellow hybrid corn, meaning that it has been altered through controlled inbreeding for a standard color, large yield, and disease resistance. While plants like avocados and mangoes today retain an air of tropical novelty to many people, though they have been grown in parts of Florida and California for well over a century, other fruits like lemons, limes, oranges, and apples feel much more familiar. But even these, and especially their commercially prominent varieties, are all comparatively recent introductions. How did we get them? Although plants were introduced to the Americas in a hodgepodge fashion from 1492 through the entire 19th century by individuals and government agents, in the late 1890s the U.S. government undertook a planned effort through the Office of Foreign Seed and Plant Introduction to introduce as many valuable foreign plants as possible to enhance the country's agricultural productions. One man, more than any other, was responsible for the program's implementation and early success: David Fairchild. This is his story. David Fairchild was born to George and Charlotte Fairchild in 1869 in Lansing, Michigan. David's father was an English professor at what is today Michigan State University, which was then one of the country's earliest land-grant colleges with an academic curriculum partly directed toward agricultural education. The first 10 years of David's life were spent rambling about the campus and its adjoining forests, where he developed a sense of wonder about the natural world. While his parents imparted in him an earnest appreciation for learning and culture, the school's agricultural and scientific faculty inculcated in him an early appreciation for the scientific study of plants, or botany. These influences intensified when in 1879 George Fairchild took a job as president of what is now Kansas State University. There, on the doorstep of the Great Plains, young David came of age, recalling that the relative scarcity of trees, a major change from Michigan, intensified his appreciation for them, and indeed for all plants. In his teenage years, he enrolled at the university and took the agricultural course, specializing in botany. His time at the college and among the farmers of the plains instilled in David an appreciation not only for botany as an abstract science, but for its concrete applications in improving human life and agriculture. Upon graduating in 1888 at the age of 19, David took up an offer from his maternal uncle, Byron Halstead, a botanist and plant pathologist who studied plant diseases, to pursue advanced study with him at what is today Iowa State University. 1 year later, Halstead received a new job at Rutgers University in New Jersey, which, in following his uncle, brought David closer to better career opportunities on the East Coast. Fairchild displayed unusual promise as a young graduate student, possessing a knack for diagnosing plant diseases and botanical illustration, and his uncle trained him in rigorous scientific methods. His Aunt Sue, meanwhile, encouraged him in literature, and bestowed him with the ambition to one day study in Europe, then a popular destination for all Americans seeking advanced education. Also in New Jersey, he first saw the Atlantic Ocean, an event that profoundly affected the young man who had never before seen such a vast body of water. He remembered it as stirring within him a desire for adventure in visiting distant shores. His abilities soon brought him to the notice of Beverly T. Galloway, an associate of his uncle and the head of the new Bureau of Plant Industry at the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C. Galloway offered him a job, and at his family's encouragement, he took it. The new division was crammed into the sweltering attic of the old USDA building, then situated on the National Mall. Although the conditions and pay were modest, the new position brought him into contact with biologists his own age who were interested in the latest scientific methods. In one episode from this time, he was working late one night at his desk when his colleague from a neighboring department, Theobald Smith, first proved that Texas cattle fever was caused by tick-borne parasites. It was revolutionary and marked the first discovery of insect-transmitted diseases, prefiguring similar discoveries concerning mosquitoes and diseases like malaria. Though he found his work with the USDA rewarding, the sudden death of his Aunt Sue rekindled in him the ambition to finish his education in Europe, and with the well wishes of his younger colleagues, he left his desk job to pursue doctoral studies in a series of European institutions in 1893 at age 24. On the voyage that carried him from New York to Naples, Italy, he made a chance encounter that would forever change the course of his life. Barbara Lathrop, born in 1847, was the son of a wealthy Chicago-based merchant. When, as a young man, he refused to pursue a career in law, as his father intended, Lathrop was cut off from family funds and pursued a career in San Francisco as a journalist. When his father died in 1889, however, he was left a considerable fortune at age 42, which prompted him to quit his job and travel the world as a collector of friends and cultural experiences. Fairchild first saw Lathrop on the ocean liner as the older man stood in his cabin door, dressed in stately pajamas and smoking a long-stemmed Turkish cigarette. It was the first time Fairchild had ever seen a pair of pajamas, as opposed to a nightshirt, and he was instantly impressed, though he did not approach the man at the time. Later on the trip, a scientist friend heard of Fairchild's dream of one day traveling to see the plants of Java, in what were then the Dutch East Indies, now Indonesia. Noting that there was one man on the ship who had been, the scientist then introduced Fairchild to Lathrop, who was busy entertaining passengers with tales of his travels and witty observations. Fairchild told Lathrop of his hopes to one day travel to Java to study after he had learned from European scientists. Lathrop, quietly impressed by the young man, told him about the place and encouraged the idea. The two parted ways when Lathrop disembarked at Gibraltar. Fairchild continued to Naples to study at the Zoological Research Station and thought he'd seen the last of Mr. Lathrop. One day, while Fairchild was busy dissecting and using a microscope to inspect marine plants, he received word that Lathrop was downstairs waiting to see him. His surprise turned to shock when Lathrop informed him that he had decided to give the young scientist $1,000, then a considerable sum, to travel to and study in Java when he was ready. The stated goal was to enable him to eventually travel the tropics and send valuable plant species back to the United States. Lathrop called the plan and Fairchild his investment in America's future. Fairchild was overjoyed and overwhelmed at the same time, and insisted that he needed more time to study before he would be up to the task. He subsequently spent the next 2 years studying at several German universities as Lathrop grew more impatient. Finally, in 1896, Fairchild secured a place to study at the Dutch Botanical Gardens in Buitenzorg, Java, today the city of Bogor. It was in Java that Fairchild's abiding interest in Asian cultures and tropical flora began. He traveled about the surrounding countryside with his fellow young scientists and Javanese assistants for a year. Among his more exciting discoveries there were the means by which termites maintained mushroom gardens in their subterranean colonies. He was especially impressed by the wide range of fruits on the island, and first encountered a plant that he would later help introduce to America, bamboo. His studies were quickly interrupted, however, when he was notified by letter that Lathrop would be arriving shortly with guests to check in on his investment. Lathrop was less than impressed by the young man he found covered in dirt, overly thin following a bout of fever, and wearing the awkward white duck suits that all Dutch officials wore. Lathrop believed that if Fairchild was ever to make a success of the plant exploration idea, he needed to cover more ground and mingle with local people, not spend all his time digging in termite mounds. Accordingly, Lathrop dropped a second bombshell on Fairchild. He proposed that he leave the botanical garden and come as Lathrop's personal travel companion across Southeast Asia and the Pacific, where the experienced globetrotter could show the novice the ropes. Feeling he could not say no, the two set off on what David later called the Lathrop-Fairchild Odyssey. Over the course of the next year, the dynamic duo traveled to Sumatra, Singapore, Bangkok, Sri Lanka, Australia, New Zealand, the Fijian and Hawaiian Islands, and then finally to San Francisco. Many comedic episodes occurred, most of which involved the generous but impatient Lathrop chiding and dragging along the jumpy and uncertain Fairchild, who wanted to stop and inspect each plant and insect that he came across. Lathrop showed him that by visiting local markets and talking with established business or social leaders, he could quickly discover what kinds of interesting plants the locals knew about and valued. He stressed the practical uses of the plants over their scientific study. They also had their share of colorful encounters. In one instance, they enjoyed a 13-course meal in the court of the King of Siam. In another, they drank psychoactive kava, prepared by old Fijian women who were topless and who chewed the root in their mouths and spit it into a bowl. Their host on that occasion spoke to them of days of old when cannibalism was freely practiced. In Hawaii, David chatted with the Sugar King, Klaus Spreckles, and considered the potential for medicinal plants to assist those suffering from leprosy. In the space of a year, it seemed that he had gained the experiences of a lifetime, especially compared to his old neighbors in Kansas. Upon his return to the United States, Fairchild was a new, more confident man who was convinced in the value of plant exploration and his own ability to conduct it. He thus returned to the USDA in Washington and pitched the idea to his superiors. After some haggling, the Office of Foreign Plant Introduction was established in 1898 with Fairchild at its head. Although the USDA had worked on an ad hoc basis with foreign contacts to import plants before, just one fruit of which was the navel orange, Fairchild now set about employing dedicated plant explorers who would travel to specific regions for years at a time to ship back as many foreign plants as possible. Packages began arriving so rapidly that at first he was forced to store loads of Russian seeds and saplings in an old carriage house until greater facilities were established. He also worked to set up introduction gardens at various stations across the country suitable for the variety of plants he was receiving, which came from all kinds of climates. One that would prove especially important was the subtropical research station he established at what was then a puny, end-of-the-line town in South Florida, Miami. Before long, however, Lathrop called upon Fairchild again, telling him that he was not suited for the desk job, and besides, there was still so much of the world he had not yet seen. How could he establish reliable contact networks in places like Africa, Arabia, or Japan if he had never seen them firsthand? Lathrop proposed a second world tour, financed by himself, on which Fairchild would work as a plant explorer, leaving the Washington office in suitable hands until he returned. Accordingly, Fairchild spent the next several years after 1898 traveling from South America to Eastern Europe, the Mediterranean, the Middle East, South Africa, and the Far East. These journeys were highly eventful and could be covered in detail on their own, but suffice to say they were extremely productive. Among the plants that he either directly or indirectly shipped back to the United States were varieties of avocado, mango, soybean, date, bamboo, kale, quinoa, and pima cotton. He also made a point of introducing a torrent of ornamental plants, one of the most notable of which was his role in introducing the Japanese flowering cherry from the Yokohama nursery of Uhei Suzuki. Upon his second return to the United States in 1902, Fairchild, now in his early 30s, resumed command of the Plant Introduction Office at the USDA. He quickly set about touring the United States to find which regions would benefit from select plant species, both the ones he had introduced and the ones his explorers would soon ship over. Although many of the tropical species, such as mangoes and avocados, could only flourish in select areas like southern Florida or California, others found homes in the American heartland. Just one notable example of which was alfalfa, which became a leguminous staple of the arid West. Two of the most notable early explorers recruited by Fairchild were Mark A. Carleton and Frank N. Meyer. Carleton was responsible for locating disease and drought-resistant wheats in Russia, which included hard red and durum varieties, the former of which now constitutes a majority of wheat produced in the United States, and the latter of which was useful for producing early commercially processed macaroni. Meyer, on the other hand, was more mysterious. A wandering gardener from the Netherlands, Meyer was recruited to travel in China, a land then famous for its lack of roads, on account of his prolific walking ability. Over a series of trips, Meyer and his Chinese assistants sent back hundreds of plants. None of his contributions has proven more famous, however, than the Meyer lemon, which today, as the disease-resistant improved variety, is one of the most popular in America. Both explorers eventually died overseas, Carleton to malaria in Peru in 1925, and Meyer under murky circumstances near Shanghai in the war-torn China of 1918, testifying to the dangers of the exploration work. Over the course of his career, and with the help of his explorers, Fairchild was involved in the introduction of roughly 30,000 plant species and varietals. By the late 1930s, the Office of Plant Introduction had done so for over 100,000. One of the most powerful lessons he learned during these years was from the prominent editor Walter Hines Page, who told Fairchild that bringing a plant to the U.S. was only half the work. Before anyone would grow or buy it, they first had to be informed and interested in it. Thus, he encouraged Fairchild to circulate stories about the new plants, how they were found, and their potential uses in newspapers and magazines. This he did at great volume. This kind of introduction work would cast a long shadow, especially since many plants Fairchild had shipped to America, like coffee is just one example, were not commercially successful when grown in the continental United States. Just because a plant could be grown in the U.S. in gardens at a hobby level did not mean the U.S. would become its major producer. Nonetheless, Fairchild's propaganda work expanded American appetites and broadened their food horizons. Fairchild's personal life was similarly fruitful. In 1904, his work and reputation brought him into contact with the famed inventor and businessman Alexander Graham Bell, who was greatly interested in the young man's exploits. Of even more interest to Fairchild, however, was Bell's daughter, Marion, whom he courted and, with the old inventor's blessing, married in 1905. Marion proved an intelligent and supportive companion who, among other things, dubbed the Japanese flowering cherries then being introduced to the Washington area cherry blossoms. Together, David and Marion raised 3 children and split their time between a Maryland residence called In the Woods, which was covered in cherry blossoms, and a summer home in Nova Scotia they shared with the extended Bell family. David's love of the tropics would not leave him, however, and the couple eventually purchased a lot in Coconut Grove, just south of Miami, in 1916. At that time it was literally a thicket of coconut trees and jungle, and David set about stocking it with the tropical fruits and flowers he had collected from around the world. Starting in the 1920s, David and Marion would spend most of their time in Florida, and they eventually built a larger house that David dubbed the Kampong, after the family compounds he had first encountered in Java. Today it is one of 5 gardens belonging to the National Tropical Botanical Garden and is open to visitors. Retirement, at least in a qualified sense, came unexpectedly for David when he was approached by the wealthy yachtsman Allison V. Armour. Armour was the son of the Chicago grain and railroad magnate George Armour, who, like Barbara Lathrop, who had died only 2 years earlier, spent his time traveling and wanted to spend his money on a worthy cause, which he saw in the now white-haired and balding Fairchild. Fairchild had a lifelong knack for drawing the attention of wealthy heirs, it seems. Armour proposed that he would find and equip a special yacht for a series of world plan expeditions if Fairchild agreed to be its resident scientist. David agreed, and for the next 6 odd years he went on a series of expeditions with Armour on the SS Utawana, resuming his plant exploration work and making shipments back to the USDA. Like his earlier journeys with Lathrop, these trips would be an interesting story in their own right. After this peripatetic period, Fairchild spent a long, peaceful retirement living mostly in Florida, like many retirees today. He wrote a series of memoirs, including The World Was My Garden, which are filled with moving details and are each worth reading, and which I will be including in the description below. As valuable as his culinary contributions were, Fairchild found another significance in his travels and in his garden. Throughout his life he possessed an aversion to cities, crowds, and noise, which he expresses repeatedly in his autobiographical writings. Perhaps what he enjoyed most about his career was that it took him to distant, remote places where he could submerge himself in the natural world and in cultures that were closer to it. In a way, his plant collecting worked also to collect memories of peoples and lifestyles that were rapidly fading away. Regrets are futile, he mused upon his 1897 stay in Hawaii, but I cannot but be sad that such a happy people, living in peace and plenty, should ever have been discovered by the white man and decimated by his diseases and civilization. I am glad that I saw a few of the quiet places of the world before the coming of automobiles and jazz. The same noisy society came to his door, too. When he first fell in love with Coconut Grove, Miami-Dade County was home to just 5,000 people. When he died, he had over 500,000 neighbors. The tangle of trees had been replaced by garages, sidewalks, and barking dogs. Even so, Fairchild found refuge in his garden and in the woods. The taste of fruits, grains, and vegetables brought back memories of his travels. His life and work were a product of the forces that he felt were erasing a more peaceful world. At the same time, his efforts helped to share its fruits with future generations. Although David Fairchild died in Coconut Grove in 1954 at the age of 85, his legacy literally lives throughout the lands of the United States and is probably sitting on your kitchen counter or in your back garden right now.